In the spring of 1982, a quiet town in New York was shaken by a disappearance that no one could explain. 16-year-old Paula Pereira, known for her bright spirit and resilience despite a difficult home life, vanished after accepting a ride on her way home. For her family, her friends, and an entire community, the days that followed were a blur of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. And as weeks turned into months, hope slowly gave way to heartbreak. Paula's case faded into the shadows, one of many tragic mysteries with no trail, no suspects, and no closure. But nearly 20 years later, everything changed with a single televised interview. A man already imprisoned, Michael Ross, spoke words that sent investigators scrambling and reopened one of New York's most haunting unsolved cases. His confession was only the beginning. Modern forensic testing would later confirm what his chilling admission implied. Paula had crossed paths with someone far more dangerous than she ever imagined. This story is not just about a tragic loss. It is about the long road to truth, the persistence of investigators, and the way a community carries the weight of unanswered questions across decades. Today, we revisit Paula's case not to focus on fear, but to honor her memory and understand how justice finally emerged after years of silence. If you find value in deep, thoughtful storytelling and want more investigations that uncover lessons from real events, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps bring more important stories like this to light. Long before investigators connected his name to Paula Pereira's disappearance, the story of Michael Ross had already been shaped by forces that few people around him ever truly understood. To trace the path that eventually led him into the center of one of New York's most unsettling cold cases, we have to go back to a childhood lived behind closed doors, where the foundations of his inner world were quietly fractured. Michael grew up in a household where stability was fragile, and the person who should have offered him protection, his mother, often became the source of fear and unpredictability. Her emotional volatility, her abrupt shifts between harshness and distance, and her inability to provide the nurturing environment a child needs left him adrift in a home that was never truly safe. In those early years, he learned not to rely on affection, not to expect warmth, and not to trust the people who were supposed to guide him. But the deepest scars came from another place entirely, an experience he carried silently, buried under layers of shame and confusion. As a young boy, he found himself vulnerable to manipulation from someone within the family circle, a teenage relative whose harmful actions left him wrestling with emotions he was not old enough to understand. This violation created a fault line inside him, one that widened as he grew older and struggled to process the conflicting mix of fear, secrecy, and distorted attachment. These were wounds that never healed, and instead formed the lens through which he would interpret relationships, power, and control for the rest of his life. As Michael moved through adolescence, the turbulence within him rarely showed on the surface. To classmates he seemed quiet, polite, even academically gifted, and those who crossed paths with him had little reason to suspect the emotional storms he fought to hide. Yet inside, patterns had already begun to take shape, patterns shaped by neglect, by trauma, and by the sense of disconnection that had followed him from childhood into adulthood. He learned to retreat into his own thoughts, creating a private world where he could escape the chaos around him. But that refuge slowly grew darker as he struggled to manage impulses and fears he could not explain. By the time he reached college, the divide between who he appeared to be and what he felt inside had become even more pronounced. He excelled academically, earning respect from professors and peers. But beneath that surface achievements existed a growing internal conflict he could no longer ignore. The unresolved pain from his early years continued to push at the edges of his behavior, shaping his view of himself and the people around him. With no stable emotional foundation and no meaningful support system, the line between coping and collapsing became dangerously thin. So when investigators later tried to piece together how Michael Ross could have intersected so violently with Paula Pereira's life, they found themselves staring at a childhood marked by distress, a youth spent navigating emotional confusion, and an adulthood built on the unstable ground created by years of silence and unaddressed trauma. His story was not one of sudden transformation but of a slow, steady unraveling that began long before the public ever heard his name. Understanding where he came from does not excuse the harm he caused, nor does it soften the tragedy of Paula's fate, but it reveals a life shaped by pain that was never confronted, leaving behind a trail of consequences that would one day pull investigators back to a forgotten case from 1982. As investigators reopened Paula Pereira's case decades after her disappearance, one name began to surface again and again, carried quietly in old reports and whispered through prison corridors. Michael Ross. By the time he spoke publicly in that unexpected BBC interview, he had already become a figure whose life story revealed a gradual descent shaped by early trauma. Fractured relationships and compounding impulses he never managed to confront. His childhood had left him navigating a maze of fear and confusion, and as he grew into adulthood, that inner turbulence did not simply fade. Instead, it took on new forms, hidden behind the image of a polite, academically gifted young man who seemed outwardly unremarkable. In the late 1970s, while classmates focused on friendships, school dances, and weekend plans, Ross struggled with urges he kept concealed from everyone around him. He lingered on quiet roads, observing strangers from a distance, studying their routines, and imagining scenarios that gave him a sense of control he lacked in real life. These early behaviors appeared harmless to the casual observer, just a young man wandering alone or watching from the edge of a crowd, but to those who would later study his patterns, they were early signals of a growing problem he neither resisted nor sought help for. By the early 1980s, Ross's actions shifted from silent observation to confrontations that left some young women shaken but unsure how to describe what had happened. These incidents, though disturbing, rarely led to formal reports, and the absence of consistent complaints allowed him to continue moving quietly through different towns without drawing attention from law enforcement. Each time he acted without consequence, his confidence grew, and so did the risks he was willing to take. The boundaries between fantasy and reality blurred, and his behavior expanded into more dangerous territory. As he traveled between New York, Connecticut, and Ohio, he developed a pattern that authorities would later recognize only after connecting multiple cases separated by distance, jurisdiction, and time. Young women, often traveling alone or simply stepping outside for a brief moment, found themselves crossing paths with someone who seemed calm, even approachable, just seconds before a situation shifted in a way they could neither predict nor escape. For years, these incidents remained isolated on paper, handled by different police departments with no knowledge of the others, creating an illusion that each tragedy stood alone. The truth, however, was that Ross had entered a period of escalation that lasted from 1981 to 1984. During these years, he moved through communities without leaving a clear trail, choosing victims whose routines made them especially vulnerable. His actions followed a rhythm only he understood, one shaped by the turmoil that had shadowed him since childhood and fueled by a growing belief that he could act without ever being discovered. In those moments, the polite exterior he showed to neighbors and classmates slipped away, replaced by someone who felt emboldened by secrecy and driven by impulses he had long stopped questioning. When Ross was eventually arrested in Connecticut in 1984, the story that emerged stunned the investigators who had worked for so long on cases that seemed to have no connection. Interviews, travel records, and evidence gradually revealed a broader pattern that crossed state lines and spanned years. It became clear that the tragedies, once viewed as isolated incidents, were part of a larger story that had unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, while families searched for answers that never came. This discovery would eventually reopen Paula Pereira's case and reshape the understanding of what had truly happened in those years, offering the first real chance to uncover the truth that had remained hidden for far too long. As investigators retraced Michael Ross's path through the early 1980s, they found themselves confronting not only the timeline of his actions but also the quieter, more troubling story of how many opportunities had passed without intervention. Long before his eventual arrest, Ross had already been on the periphery of police attention. There were complaints from young women who described frightening encounters that they struggled to put into precise words, short detentions that led nowhere, and scattered reports that hinted at a pattern yet never accumulated in a single file. Each incident, viewed individually, seemed limited in scope, and without broader context, officers handled them as routine disturbances rather than signs of a deepening crisis. In those years, law enforcement agencies operated in a world without the interconnected databases and cross-jurisdiction communication that are now considered standard. Records moved slowly, if at, and small departments often lacked the resources to track individuals across towns or state lines. When Ross encountered legal trouble, the charges he faced were often reduced, resulting in brief sentences or periods of supervision that reflected only the isolated incident at hand rather than the emerging behavioral pattern. Judges issued probation in cases where stronger action might have prevented future harm, and those tasked with monitoring him rarely saw cause for alarm. Compounding this situation was the absence of sustained psychiatric evaluation. Ross had displayed troubling behaviors since adolescence, yet the interventions he received were minimal and short-lived. Early concerns voiced by those who knew him never translated into long-term oversight, and the complexity of his inner struggles remained largely unexamined. Moments when authorities might have paused to explore his psychological state were instead treated as procedural formalities, with assessments that revealed only fragments of the truth. Once he completed a required meeting or short-term program, the system considered its obligation fulfilled, even as the underlying issues remained unresolved. When Ross moved to another city or state, he essentially reset his relationship with law enforcement. To new officers, he appeared as an unfamiliar name with no concerning history, allowing him to blend into community life and move freely without triggering any meaningful scrutiny. This freedom created a dangerous space in which his actions escalated. He began to travel greater distances, seek out vulnerable individuals, and operate with a confidence shaped by his belief that no one was watching closely enough to connect the dots. Years later, when investigators finally assembled the timeline of his movements and encounters with the justice system, they were struck by how many points along that journey might have offered an opportunity for intervention. A firmer sentence here, a deeper psychological evaluation there, or a coordinated exchange of information between departments might have altered the trajectory of the case entirely. Instead, the system treated each event as an isolated moment, unaware that it was part of a much larger story unfolding across several states. This pattern of missed chances would eventually play a significant role in understanding how Ross managed to continue harming others long after authorities first came into contact with him. It also became a central element in reopening old investigations, including Paula Pereira's case, where a community's lingering questions were finally placed within a broader context. As the full picture emerged, it revealed not only the complexity of Ross's path, but also the vulnerabilities within the institutions responsible for protecting the public, setting the stage for a reckoning that would unfold as the truth came into clearer focus. As the legal proceedings surrounding Michael Ross unfolded, the courtroom became a stage where the intersection of human psychology, law, and morality was brought into sharp focus. His early life, marked by trauma and abuse, had already been pieced together by investigators seeking to understand the origins of his violent behavior. And now, decades later, that same history became a central point of debate in a legal systems struggling to reconcile accountability with mental health. Psychiatrists and forensic experts were called upon to testify, painting a picture of a man whose compulsions were not simply a matter of choice, but instead rooted in deeply ingrained psychological disorders. Among the most significant diagnoses was sexual sadism, a condition in which an individual experiences intense arousal from the suffering of others. A diagnosis that seemed to explain, at least in part, the meticulous yet horrifying patterns that had emerged in his crimes. The defense team argued that Ross's disorder should be considered a mitigating factor during sentencing, emphasizing that his impulses were not merely criminal but symptomatic of a mind overrun by forces beyond rational control. They presented testimony that his compulsions were relentless, intrusive, and intertwined with feelings of shame, self-loathing, and distress. Expert witnesses described how treatment, including pharmacological interventions, had at times offered temporary relief, allowing Ross brief glimpses of self-restraint. But these moments were fleeting, constantly challenged by the depth of his psychological condition. The defense contended that understanding the origin and persistence of his disorder could offer insight not only into his crimes but also into the nature of human pathology, and might warrant a sentence that reflected both accountability and acknowledgement of his compromised mental state. Yet the prosecution painted a different picture, one grounded in the tangible horror left in the wake of his actions. They highlighted the meticulous planning, the repeated targeting of vulnerable victims, and the careful execution of crimes across state lines. To them, Ross's disorder did not absolve him. It contextualized his cruelty but did not diminish the fact that each act required calculation, choice, and execution. Witnesses from the victims' families provided visceral testimony, recounting the lives lost, the communities shattered, and the lasting pain that no explanation could erase. The prosecution argued that mental illness, no matter how severe, did not erase personal responsibility, particularly when patterns of premeditation and evasion demonstrated a clear awareness of wrongdoing. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to navigate the difficult terrain between clinical insight and moral judgment, weighing scientific testimony against the stark reality of brutal acts that had taken the lives of young women whose futures were abruptly stolen. The tension in the courtroom reflected a larger societal struggle to reconcile the nuances of psychological disorder with the expectations of justice, leaving everyone involved grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Throughout multiple appeals, this debate persisted, centering on whether the understanding of Ross's psychological condition should influence the severity of his punishment, or whether the sheer scope of his crimes demanded the ultimate legal consequence. Ultimately, these proceedings revealed the complex interplay between human behavior and societal norms, underscoring the challenges inherent in addressing cases where the boundaries between pathology and culpability are blurred. Ross's trials became more than a reckoning with his individual actions. They were a test of the legal system's ability to balance empathy, science, and justice in the face of crimes that defied simple explanation. Each witness, each expert, and each piece of evidence contributed to a narrative that was as unsettling as it was illuminating, leaving a lasting impression on all who observed the intersection of law and the human mind in one of the most disturbing cases of the late 20th century. Decades of investigation, courtroom drama, and appeals finally drew to a close in the story of Michael Ross, a man whose life had become a dark thread woven through the memories of countless families and communities. After years of legal wrangling, delays, and repeated examinations of his mental state, Ross made the decision to end his appeals, choosing to accept the ultimate consequence for his actions. His choice marked the final chapter in a story that had begun in the early 1980s with the disappearance of young women whose lives were tragically cut short, including Paula Pereira, whose case had remained unsolved for nearly 2 decades. In a moment that brought decades of sorrow, grief, and uncertainty to a close, Ross was executed by lethal injection on May 13, 2005, at Osborne Correctional Institution in Connecticut, becoming the first person to face execution in the state in 45 years. The day of his execution was heavy with emotion, attended by members of the victims' families who had lived with the pain of loss for years. For them, it was a mixture of relief, sorrow, and reflection, a moment where the slow machinery of justice had finally reached its endpoint. While some felt closure, others could not forget the void left behind. The birthdays, milestones, and everyday moments that would never be shared with the loved ones taken from them. Michael Ross's final moments were a stark reminder of both the human capacity for violence and the enduring impact of trauma on families and communities alike. Throughout the lengthy legal process, Ross's life had been examined from every angle: his upbringing, the abuse he suffered, the mental illnesses diagnosed, the expert testimony that tried to explain the unexplainable. Yet, even with all the analysis, writings, and debates, the verdict ultimately reflected society's demand for accountability and the need to uphold justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Ross' decision to forego further appeals, despite protests and efforts from public defenders who sought to save him, added a controversial layer to his story. Some saw it as an acceptance of responsibility, a final acknowledgement of the pain he had caused, while others questioned whether it was truly voluntary or a consequence of a troubled mind that had long been wrestling with its own compulsions. As we reflect on the story of Michael Ross, it is a sobering reminder of the fragility of safety, the importance of vigilance, and the lasting effects of unchecked psychological issues and systemic failures. The lives of his victims, like Paula Pereira, Tammy Williams, Robin Stinsky, and others, are not forgotten. Their stories underscore the need for communities, law enforcement, and society as a whole to recognize warning signs and act decisively to prevent tragedies before they escalate. The legal journey, though complex and prolonged, ultimately highlighted both the strengths and shortcomings of the justice system, showing the delicate balance between understanding human psychology and enforcing accountability. Thank you for watching and taking the time to follow this story to its conclusion. If you found this exploration informative and thought-provoking, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into compelling true crime stories, historical cases, and the human stories behind them. Your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light, honoring the memories of those affected and offering insight into the ways we can better understand the complex world around us.